The desert wind carried with it a dry whistle that scraped against the ear, the kind of sound that told of dust, sun, and the endless miles of nothing. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies, oxen groaned in the heat, and men shouted bids that rose above the crowd in that small outpost town. The air smelled of sweat, tobacco, and something sharper desperation. She stood there, her hands pressed against the swell of her belly, the weight of her unborn child heavy in more ways than one. In her pocket, only a few pesos clinked together. She had come to trade for cloth, maybe a sack of beans, but her eyes were caught by something else entirely. Something, or rather someone shackled and hooded, standing in the auction yard like an animal meant for labor. The man on the block wasn't just another drifter or thief, though. The crowd whispered the word Apache with that mix of fear and scorn the settlers carried for the people whose land they claimed. His broad shoulders were roped in chains, his head covered with a burlap sack that made him faceless. And yet there was no mistaking the power of him. The scars down his arms, the dark bronze of his skin, the stillness in his posture, all spoke of a man unbroken. And though he was bound, though the auctioneer shouted his price as though he were cattle, there was a quiet storm beneath that hood. She could feel it even from where she stood. The bidding started higher than she imagined. Men with thick beards and rough boots called out numbers, their mouths curled in cruel grins, thinking of the strength in his arms and how it might serve them. She watched as the price tumbled downward, the auctioneer's voice growing impatient. 2 pesos, he barked finally, almost mocking. 2 pesos, so little, it was almost shameful. And yet not a hand went up. Fear was stronger than greed that day. No one wanted to bring an Apache into their camp. No one except her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted her hand, almost without knowing why. The crowd turned, disbelief heavy in their eyes. A woman belly round with child, bidding for a chained warrior? It was madness. Yet the hammer fell, and the man was hers. Just like that. 2 pesos traded hands, and silence followed her as she stepped forward. She could feel every gaze burning into her back, every whisper cutting the air, but she didn't falter. Something inside her, something deeper than reason, had guided her hand. The soldiers guarding him sneered as they passed her the chain. The iron links were rough, heavier than she expected. She swallowed, feeling the tremor in her palms as she gripped it. The man didn't move. He stood taller than the rest, shoulders squared as though the hood gave him back his dignity. She could not see his face, but she felt the weight of his gaze through the burlap. And in that moment, a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. She thought of the child inside her, of the long trail ahead, of the uncertain future she walked into. She had no husband now, no family to shield her, and yet here she was, holding the chain of a man who could crush her throat with one hand if he chose. Still, instead of fear, something else stirred within her. Curiosity, the sense that fate had spun a strange thread, and tied it to her heart. Her fingers lifted, almost hesitating, then grasped the edge of the hood. The cloth was coarse, smelling of dust and sweat, and she pulled it slowly, as though peeling back a secret the world wasn't meant to know. The crowd leaned in, eager to see, eager to confirm the savage face behind the mask. She braced herself for what would come, for the eyes that would meet hers, for the truth of what she had purchased with those last 2 pesos. But as the hood slipped away, the air seemed to still, and what she saw left her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, everything, wagon wheels, cattle lowing, the murmur of voices, faded into silence. What stared back at her wasn't what she had expected at all, and in that instant she knew her life, and the life of the child she carried, would never again be the same. His eyes were the first thing she saw. Dark as the canyon shadows at dusk, steady and unblinking. They held none of the wild fury the settlers always spoke of when they spoke of Apaches. Instead, they carried something far quieter, far more dangerous. It was the look of a man who had lost much, and yet still refused to bow. The scars on his cheek told of battles past, but it was the silence in his gaze that unsettled her the most. He did not look at her with anger, nor did he look with fear. He looked as though he could see past her skin and into her very thoughts, as if the weight she carried was not just the child, but all the choices that had led her here. the crowd gasped, then murmured with low voices that tangled like snakes. Some shook their heads, muttering that she had cursed herself by laying hands on him. Others spat in the dirt and turned away. The auctioneer wasted no more time. To him it was done. The pesos were in his hand and the Apache was her burden now. She tried to steady herself as she adjusted her shawl over her shoulders. The desert sun was still harsh, though the day leaned toward evening and the ground glowed with the color of burnt clay. She felt sweat on the back of her neck, and her swollen feet throbbed in her worn boots. Yet none of that pressed on her as much as the man standing before her. Unhooded at last, she tugged gently on the chain, not certain what she expected. He followed, his steps deliberate, his posture tall, even though his wrists were bound. Each rattle of the iron cuffs echoed like a warning. She glanced once at the child resting heavy in her womb and wondered what kind of madness had led her here. Yet something deep inside told her there was more to this moment than foolish impulse. Something in her bones whispered that life rarely offered second chances. And this one had come dressed in chains. They walked together out of the auction yard. Through the dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, faces peered from doorways, women holding children close, men standing with arms crossed, watching her every step. She felt their judgment pierce her back like thorns. A young boy threw a stone that clinked harmlessly against the wagon wheel, but she saw the flare of resentment in the Apache's eyes for the first time. He said nothing, only glanced at her with a look that seemed to ask why she would bring him through such shame. She had no answer, only silence, for she herself did not know. When they reached her wagon, she paused, her hand pressed against her lower back for strength. The wagon was old, patched with boards and rope, its wheels groaning beneath the load of her few belongings. She had come west with dreams, once dreams of building a small place with her husband, who had not lived long enough to see it. The fever had taken him, swift as lightning, leaving her alone with an unborn child and a trail she could not abandon. It was desperation that had driven her to this auction. Desperation and a quiet voice inside that urged her forward when everything else told her to turn. Back, she gestured for him to climb into the wagon. He stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on her, testing, measuring. Then he obeyed, the chains clinking as he settled against the wooden boards. The oxen shifted and snorted, sensing the weight of the moment. She gathered the reins with trembling hands and gave a low call to set them moving. The wagon rolled slowly out of town, the dust rising behind them like a curtain closing on the whispers that trailed in their wake. The road stretched long and empty, cutting through dry plains dotted with cactus and scrub. The silence between them was heavy. She could feel his gaze from the back of the wagon, steady as the desert heat. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I had 2 pesos left. That's all. I thought I was buying time. Maybe a little help for the journey. Her words trailed off, uncertain if she spoke to him or herself. He said nothing. Not a word, but his eyes did not waver. She remembered the stories told around fires, stories of raids, of arrows in the night, of women taken and men slaughtered. She remembered to the quieter stories, the ones older women whispered when the men were away, of people who had lived on this land long before wagons creaked through it, who had known its rivers and its mountains like kin. She looked at him again and wondered which story he belonged to, or if the truth was something altogether different as the sun began to sink lower. Painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, she pulled the wagon off the trail. Her body ached, her breath came shallow, and she knew she needed rest. She set the brake and climbed down slowly, her hand steadying her belly. He watched, still silent, as she gathered a small fire with twigs and dry brush. The sparks caught, and soon a flame flickered, casting shadows across his face. It was in that light that she truly studied him. The sharp angles of his jaw, the strength in his arms even bound, the quiet steadiness that felt older than the hills themselves. Her stomach growled, and she reached for a small sack of beans. With careful hands, she boiled a meager portion over the fire. She ate slowly, then hesitated before offering the pot toward him. For a moment, she wondered if he would refuse, if he would spit at her gesture. Instead, he leaned forward, chains clinking softly, and ate with a quiet dignity that surprised her. Not a sound of thanks, not a word spoken. But something passed between them in the act, understanding that food was life, and life was still shared, even across chains. The night deepened, the fire crackling low, coyotes calling from the hills. She pulled her shawl tighter, lying back against the wagon wheel, though sleep would not come easy. Every sound seemed louder in the dark, every movement sharper. She kept glancing at him, half expecting him to slip the chains and vanish into the night, or worse. Yet he remained where he was, his eyes lifted to the stars as though he drew strength from them. As the child inside her shifted, she pressed her hands to her belly and whispered soft words, words of comfort more for herself than for the little one. She thought of the road ahead, of the dangers waiting on the trail, of the weight of the decision she had made. She had bought him for 2 pesos, but she knew now it was more than a bargain. It was a gamble, one she did not yet understand. The fire dimmed to glowing embers, and the desert night pressed in close. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, and the sound carried across the emptiness like a warning. She closed her eyes, heart pounding, knowing that when dawn came, her journey with him would truly begin. Yet even then, she could not shake the memory of his eyes, steady and unyielding, nor the uneasy truth that her life was no longer her own to guide. It was bound now, as surely as the chain between them, to a man whose silence spoke louder than any words. And as she drifted toward uneasy sleep, a single thought clung to her mind. She had unhooded him, but she had not yet seen the whole of what she had bought. That revelation was still waiting, hidden in his silence. Ready to rise when she least expected it, dawn came slowly across the desert. With pale light spreading over the rocks and brush until the horizon glowed like an ember, she stirred awake with her shawl still wrapped tight and her back aching from the wagon wheel. For a moment, she forgot what had happened the day before, until the sound of chains reminded her. He was still there, sitting near the dying fire, his eyes fixed on her in that same quiet, steady way. The night had not broken him, nor had the chains. She wondered if anything could. She rose stiffly, brushing the dust from her skirt, and reached for the reins. The road was long, and if she meant to keep ahead of the soldiers and settlers who might question her choices, she needed to move. As she hitched the oxen, she felt his gaze follow every movement, not with impatience, not with mockery, but with an unreadable patience. She told herself she would speak to him soon, try to understand what kind of man she had tied her fate to. But the words would not come, so she climbed onto the wagon seat and urged the team forward. The days that followed were a test of will. The trail grew rougher, marked with gullies and stretches of dry riverbeds. Each time the wagon lurched, she winced, fearing for the child she carried. She rationed her food carefully, knowing the journey ahead held no certainty of supplies. At night, she shared small portions with him, though the beans and cornmeal dwindled quicker than she liked. He ate without complaint, never demanding more. Though she knew his strength needed more than she could spare, it was on the 3rd night that she noticed something different. As she sat close to the fire, fighting sleep, she caught sight of him lifting his hands. His wrists were still bound, but his fingers moved with purpose. At first, she thought he was struggling against the iron. But then she realized he was shaping symbols in the dirt with the tips of his fingers. Lines, circles, marks she did not understand. When he looked up and caught her watching, he covered them quickly, his eyes flashing with something between warning and shame. She said nothing, but the image of those hidden symbols burned in her mind. By the 5th day, the land itself became an enemy. A storm rolled across the plains, heavy with dust, the sky turning the color of rust. She wrapped cloth around her face, shielding her swollen belly with her arms as the wind screamed. The oxen fought to keep moving, and the wagon tilted dangerously in the gale. She heard the chains rattle as he leaned forward, his broad frame bracing against the side of the wagon to keep it from tipping. It was the first time he had moved without her bidding, the first time he acted to save her rather than himself. When the storm passed and silence settled again, she looked at him with new eyes. He had not spoken, not once, yet his actions had said enough. Still, trust was a fragile thing. That night she dreamed of men in uniform riding hard, shouting about stolen land and stolen lives. She dreamed of torches and cries of vengeance. When she woke, the fire had burned low, and the desert was too quiet. Her heart lurched in panic, fearing he had slipped away. But then she saw him sitting only a few paces from her, his chains heavy in the moonlight. His eyes once again turned skyward. The tension deepened when they came upon the first settlement. A cluster of cabins stood along the trail, smoke rising from chimneys, dogs barking as the wagon approached. She felt every eye on her, saw the suspicion in the men who leaned on their rifles as she passed. Children darted behind fences, whispering. The chains rattled once, and the sound brought a sharp silence to the street. One of the men stepped forward, his voice rough. "Where you taking him, woman?" She gripped the reins tighter, her throat dry. "Bought him at auction," she said, her voice steady though her heart thundered. "He's mine to take." The man spat in the dirt. "Best sell him off again before trouble follows." "Folks don't take kindly to that kind on these roads." She said nothing more, only flicked the reins and urged the oxen onward. But she could feel the heat of their glares on her back until the cabins disappeared behind them. That night, her hands trembled as she lit the fire. She thought of what the settler had said, of the way his eyes had lingered on her swollen belly. She wondered if the danger was not only from the Apache beside her, but from every man who saw her traveling alone. The days blurred together, each one marked by the rattle of chains and the groan of wagon wheels. She found herself studying him in small moments, how he scanned the horizon with sharp eyes, though he sat still as stone, conserving his strength. She wondered about the marks he had drawn in the dirt, about the life he had lived before the soldiers caught him. She wanted to ask, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she spoke of herself quietly, as though confessing to the desert. She told him of her husband lost to fever, of the small patch of land they had dreamed of tilling, of the nights she had spent alone, with only the sound of the wind for company. He never replied, but sometimes she thought she saw something soften in his gaze, a flicker of understanding she could not name. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she heard a sound beyond the brush. A branch snapped, followed by hushed voices. She froze, reaching instinctively for the small knife tucked in her bundle. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, he nodded. Just a slight movement, but it was enough. The voices drew nearer, and she caught the words, drifters, maybe men looking for easy spoils. Her heart raced as shadows flickered against the firelight. She prayed they would pass, but then a figure stepped into the clearing. The man grinned, his teeth yellow in the glow. "Travelin' alone, ma'am?" he asked, his gaze sliding to her belly, then to the chains behind her. His grin widened. Or maybe not so alone. Her fingers tightened on the knife. The Apache sat still, his face unreadable, but his body coiled like a spring. The intruder's eyes lingered too long, and she knew what would follow if they stayed. She lifted her chin, forcing strength into her voice. "We're leaving at first light. You'd best move on." The man chuckled. But something in her eyes must have unsettled him, for after a long pause he spat in the dirt and backed away. His footsteps faded into the night, though she knew this was not the last she'd see of men like him. When she turned back, the Apache's gaze was fixed on her, steady and sharp, as if measuring her in a new light. That night, sleep refused her. She thought of the dangers pressing from all sides, settlers who mistrusted her, drifters who saw her as prey, and the silent man chained in her wagon who could shift the balance of her fate with a single decision. She knew the road ahead was growing darker, each mile dragging her closer to a truth she had not yet faced, in the silence before dawn. As the fire smoldered to ash, she pressed her hand against her belly and whispered to the child within. "We will keep moving," she said softly. No matter what comes, she lifted her eyes then, and saw his watching her still, the chain between them gleaming in the faint light. Neither spoke, but in that silence hung the weight of what was to come, the collision of two lives bound by chance, shadowed by danger and shaped by secrets not yet revealed. The conflict was no longer just the chain that bound him, or the whispers of strangers. It was the trail itself, the endless questions of trust, and the storm gathering on the horizon. She could not turn back, and he would not bend. The clash between them and the world pressing against them had only just begun. The trail grew harsher as the days dragged on, winding through canyons where shadows clung to the rock like secrets. The wagon groaned under the strain, and the oxen slowed with every passing mile. She felt the weight of the land pressing in, the silence between them growing sharper. Each sunrise seemed to carry them deeper into a place where no law reached, no town claimed ownership, and no help would come if trouble found them. Her hands were blistered from gripping the reins. Her back ached from the heaviness of the child, and yet she pressed forward, driven by something she could not name. The Apache's silence was no longer empty. It was filled with meaning, with a presence she could not shake. He watched the land with eyes sharper than a hawk, scanning ridges, listening to sounds she'd never noticed. Sometimes he would tense suddenly, and though she saw nothing, she felt the hairs rise on her neck, certain that danger had passed close. His silence was not the silence of surrender, but of a man who carried knowledge she did not have. She wondered if he was guiding her without words, if the chain that bound him was less powerful than the strength of his will. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they reached a narrow pass. The rocks rose high on either side, casting long shadows that swallowed the wagon whole. The oxen hesitated, snorting, their hooves clattering on the stones. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The place was too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath. She glanced at him, and for the first time since she had unhooded him, he moved without restraint. He leaned forward, his eyes flashing in warning, and shook his head slowly. Her breath caught. She did not need words to understand. Danger waited in the shadows. A moment later, the sound of rifles cocking echoed off the canyon walls. Voices shouted, rough and confident, and figures stepped into view above them, rifles glinting in the fading light. Her heart dropped as she counted them 6, maybe more, all with the look of men who lived by taking what they wanted. One called down, his grin wide and cruel. "That wagon's ours. Hand over the goods, woman. Maybe we'll let you keep walking." Her hand trembled on the reins, her pulse thundering in her ears. She looked at the Apache, and for the first time he met her gaze not with distance but with urgency. His eyes told her what his chains forbade him to say. She had no chance alone. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had bought him for 2 pesos, a choice born of impulse and desperation. But now she saw the truth. This man, chained and silent, was the only shield standing between her and certain ruin. The bandits shouted again, their rifles trained on her. One of them slid down the rock face with a lazy confidence, his boots crunching against gravel as he approached. His eyes flicked to her swollen belly and then to the chained man in the wagon. He laughed, shaking his head. "You picked yourself a fine mess, didn't you? A pregnant widow and a wild dog in irons." His hand reached for the wagon rail. And in that instant, the Apache shifted, his chains rattling like thunder. His posture alone was enough to make the man hesitate, though he sneered to cover it. She knew the fire was about to break. Her mind spun through choices she didn't have, through chances too slim to count. If she pleaded, they would laugh. If she fought, she would lose. And yet, in the center of that fear, a spark lit inside, her stubborn will that had carried her this far. She sat taller on the wagon seat, her voice sharp though her heart trembled. "This wagon isn't yours. Leave now, or you'll regret staying." The bandits roared with laughter, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. The man closest sneered, stepping forward again. "And what's to stop us, woman?" "Him." He jabbed a thumb at the chained figure. "He's just a beast with no teeth." But even as the words left his mouth, the Apache's eyes burned brighter, unyielding, like the heart of a storm. She felt it then, the shift in the air, the edge of something inevitable. The chains could not erase what he was. The man was not broken, not tamed, and the longer she looked into his eyes, the more she believed that unleashing him, though dangerous, might be her only chance. Night pressed in faster than she expected, the shadows deepening until the canyon seemed alive with menace. The bandits settled in, certain of their victory, laughing, eating, waiting for the moment they would strike. She could not sleep, her hand resting on her belly as the child moved restlessly within. Every time she looked at him, sitting silently at the edge of the fire, she wondered if she dared to trust him. If she slipped the lock, if she loosed the iron, what would he do? Would he turn on her? Or would he stand against the wolves, circling closer? By morning, her choice felt heavier than the desert sky. The bandits were still there, watching from the rocks, their rifles never far. She knew they were only waiting until her strength faltered, until hunger and fear made her weak enough to take. She rose slowly, her back stiff, and her eyes fell on him. The chain glinted in the light, a cruel reminder of the power she held. But the truth was clear now. She held no power at all. The decision was not about control. It was about survival. The road stretched ahead, but it was blocked by shadows that would not let her pass. The child inside her turned again, as if sensing the storm gathering. She drew a shaky breath, her hand brushing against the iron clasp that held his chains. The key was tucked in the small leather pouch she wore close, its weight burning against her side like a secret she could no longer keep. When she met his eyes, she found no plea, no anger, only the stillness of a man waiting for the world to decide. She knew that once the lock was opened, there would be no turning back. The bandits would come, blood would be spilled, and the path she had chosen would carry her into darkness she could not yet see. But if she did nothing, she and her unborn child would be swallowed by that darkness all the same. The sun rose higher, the canyon walls blazed with heat. The bandits began to stir, their voices carrying across the rocks, sharper now, more impatient. She felt her heart race as she reached for the pouch, her fingers trembling. The sound of iron rattling filled her ears, louder than the cry of birds, louder than the wind. The moment was near, pressing down on her like a weight too heavy to bear. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone could hear. When she opened them, the decision stood before her in flesh and bone, bound but unbroken, waiting in silence. The world around her narrowed to that single choice, the turning point of everything she had lived through, everything she carried within her. And as the bandits' laughter grew sharper, echoing off the canyon stone, she knew the climax was not waiting in some far-off place. It was here, now, in the rattle of chains and the fire in his eyes. The moment of release hung in the air, a breath away. The line between survival and ruin drawn as thin as a strand of hair. She tightened her grip on the pouch, the key cold against her palm, and felt the desert itself hold still, as if the earth was waiting to see what she would do. The wagon, the child, the man in chains, the guns and the rocks, all of it spun together in a storm she could no longer escape. The clash was coming, fierce and unrelenting, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with the weight of it. She drew in a sharp breath, her heart pounding louder than the bandits' jeers, louder than the rattle of the wagon wheels, louder than the desert wind. And in that suspended moment, every choice, every fear, every thread of fate pulled tight, leading straight into the heart of the storm about to break. The key turned with a click that echoed louder in her ears than the jeers of the bandits above. For a breath, nothing moved. The Apache sat still, his wrists freed at last, the chains sliding down to the dust, his eyes lifted to hers. And in that fleeting glance she felt both the weight of her gamble and the strange certainty that she had chosen the only path left. He rose slowly, like a storm gathering its full force. And the canyon seemed to shift with him. The bandits had grown careless, laughing too loudly, their rifles held loosely as if the woman in her wagon were already theirs. They did not see the change until it was too late. The Apache moved with a speed she had not imagined possible, leaping for the man closest to the fire. The first rifle cracked, but the bullet sparked harmlessly against the stone. Chains became weapons in his hands, striking hard, and the canyon filled with shouts and curses. She clutched the wagon rail, frozen between terror and awe as the fight unfolded in bursts of dust and firelight. He was outnumbered, but he was not outmatched. Each movement was deliberate, each strike heavy with years of skill. The bandits had come for an easy prize, but what they faced was a man who refused to kneel. She knew she should flee, urge the oxen forward, but her body would not move. Something held her there, watching the storm she had unleashed. The fight raged until the canyon grew quiet again, the echoes fading into silence. A few of the bandits fled into the rocks, their shouts carrying far into the distance, but the rest lay broken on the ground. The Apache stood tall among them, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and dust. His eyes found hers once more, and though no words passed between them, she understood. He had fought not for chains, not for freedom alone, but for her and the child she carried. When the danger passed, she busied herself with trembling hands, gathering what little she had left. He returned to the wagon without a sound, his body scarred and bloodied, yet his presence steady as ever. She offered him water, and for the first time he accepted it without hesitation. The simple act felt like a bond, fragile but real, forged in fire and blood. The journey did not end that day. The road stretched onward, winding through desert valleys and over rocky hills. She drove the wagon, and he walked beside it, no longer bound by iron, but tied instead by something far stronger. He scouted ahead, found water where she would have seen only dust, and stood watch at night while she slept. Slowly, the fear between them shifted into a cautious trust. One evening, as they rested by a riverbed, she found the courage to ask. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "What do I call you?" For a long time he was silent, the fire crackling between them. Then, at last, he spoke his first word to her since the auction. He told her his name, a sound shaped like the wind over stone. She repeated it, stumbling over the syllables, and his eyes softened, just barely. It was enough. The days grew warmer, and with them came the stirrings of her child ready to meet the world. She feared the moment, feared being alone when the time came, but he seemed to sense it. He gathered herbs, found clean water, and built stronger fires at night. He never said more than a few words, but his presence was constant, shield against the emptiness of the trail. At last, when the pains came, it was under the wide sky of a valley rimmed with pines. She gripped the wagon rail, breath ragged, her strength nearly gone. But he was there, steady, guiding her through with patience and care she had not expected. The night stretched long, but by dawn a cry arose into the air, thin, a strong wail that silenced even the wind. She held her child close, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time since her husband's passing, she felt the warmth of hope. He stood nearby, watching quietly, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. She lifted her eyes to him, gratitude deeper than words filling her chest. "We are still here," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. He gave a small nod. The faintest flicker of something like peace crossing his expression. The weeks that followed brought new challenges, but they faced them together. The road grew easier with his knowledge of the land, and the child thrived in her arms. They found settlements where no one asked questions, where she could trade small goods for food, and where his silence kept them safe. The whispers that had once followed her seemed far away now, lost to the dust of the trail behind them. In time, she understood what had begun that day at the auction. She had not bought a man for 2 pesos. She had bought a chance. Fragile and uncertain, to keep moving forward when the world had turned its back. What grew between them was not born of chains or bargains, but of survival, of firelight, of the endless miles that wore down fear until only trust remained. When at last they reached a valley that seemed untouched by war or greed, she knew it was the place to stop. The river ran clear, the soil was dark and rich, and the pines stood tall as guardians. She stepped down from the wagon, her child in her arms, and looked at him. "Here," she said softly. "This is where we stay." He stood for a long moment, scanning the land, his face unreadable. Then he gave a single nod, and together they began to build. She planted seeds in the soil, he raised walls of wood and stone, and the child grew among them, laughter mingling with the sound of water rushing over rocks. The whispers of the past never fully vanished. She knew there would always be those who looked at him with fear, at her with judgment, but the life they built was stronger than that. It was a life forged in hardship, bound by trust, and lit by the flame of hope that refused to die. She often thought back to that day, to the dust of the auction yard, to the hood pulled from his face, To the moment she raised her hand when no one else dared. She remembered the weight of the coins, the silence that followed, and the fire in his eyes. 2 pesos had changed everything. It had bought her not a slave, not a servant, but the beginning of a story she had never imagined. As seasons turned and the valley bloomed around them, she would sit by the fire at night, her child asleep in her arms, and glance at him across the flames. He still spoke little, still carried the weight of his past in his eyes, but she no longer feared that silence. It was the silence of a man who had endured, who had found a place to stand, and who had chosen to stay. The desert wind still whispered through her dreams, but it no longer carried despair. It carried memory, and with it, the reminder that even the smallest choice could shape a life forever. She had lifted her hand for 2 pesos, and in return, she had found not only survival, but a future. And in the quiet of their valley, under a sky bright with stars, she knew that her story was no longer one of loss. It was a story of beginning again, of finding strength in the most unlikely of places, then of trusting that even in the harshest of lands, hope could take root and grow.